Good morning and welcome to Water's Edge Church Online. We're glad that you're here with us this morning. I hope that you are ready to worship God in song. The words are going to be up on your screen. We're going to start this morning by singing How Great Thou Art. Oh Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the works thy hands have made, I see the stars, I hear the mighty thunder that power throughout the universe displayed. Through the woods, when through the woods and forest glades I wander and hear the birds sing sweetly in the trees. When I look down from lofty mountain grandeur and hear the brook and feel the gentle breeze, then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. And when I think that God his Son not sparing sent him to die, I scarce can take it in, that on the cross, my burden gladly bearing, he bled and died to take away my sin. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. When Christ shall come with shout of acclamation and take me home, what joy shall fill my heart. Then I shall bow with humble adoration and there proclaim, my God, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art, how great thou art, how great thou art. The splendor of the King. Sing how great our God is this morning. The splendor of the King. He wraps himself in light. Darkness tries to hide and trembles at his voice, and trembles at his voice. How great is our God? Sing with me, how great is our God, and all will see how great is our God. An age to wait, she stands. Time is in his hands. Beginning and the end. Beginning and the end. The Godhead, 3 in 1. Father, Spirit, Son, the Lion and the Lamb, the Lion and the Lamb. How great is our God? Sing with me, how great is our God, and all will sing how great is our God. Name above all names. Name above all names. Worthy of all praise. My heart will sing how great is our God. You are the name above all names. You are worthy of all praise. My heart will sing how great is our God. How great is our God? Sing with me, how great is our God, and all will sing how great is our God. How great is our God? Sing with me, how great is our God, and all will see how great is our God.
For the moms who raised us up, gave us hope, and made us strong. For the young moms who became moms sooner than expected and gave it all they had. For the single moms who had to figure out how to do this on their own. For those who never got called mom, but who cared for us all like a mom would. For the hurting moms who've loved and lost but never given up. For the praying moms who don't always know what to do, but always know who to talk to. For the working moms, the stay-home moms, the cooking moms, and the takeout moms. For taking care of us when you barely had enough time to take care of yourself. For teaching us how to walk and how to make a difference. For the late night snuggles and the early morning pancakes. For sitting with us after our first breakup. For lifting us up when others put us down. For the rides, the meals, the laundry, and the birthday parties. For the years, tears, laughter, and love. It's not enough, but we want to say thank you. Thank you for doing for us what we could never do for ourselves. We love you. We honor you. We remember you. We thank you.
Welcome back. I love the lyrics of this next song. It makes me feel like no matter what I've done, how hard this week has been, or times in my past, that it's okay to still come to God because we're all just gracefully broken. Take all I have in these hands and multiply, God, all that I am, and find my heart on the altar again. Set me on fire, set me on fire. Take all I have in these hands and multiply, God, all that I am, and find my heart on the altar again. Set me on fire, set me on fire. Here I am, God, arms wide open, pouring out my life, gracefully broken. My heart stands in awe of your name. Your mighty love stands strong to the end. You will fulfill your purpose for me. You won't forsake me. You will be with me. Here I am, God, arms wide open, pouring out my life, gracefully broken. Here I am, God, arms wide open, pouring out my life, gracefully broken. All to Jesus now, all to Jesus now, holding nothing back, holding nothing back. I surrender, I surrender, I surrender, I surrender. Here I am, God, arms wide open, pouring out my life, gracefully broken. Here I am, God, arms wide open, pouring out my life, gracefully broken. It's your power, God, in us. Your power at work in me. I'm broken gracefully. I'm strong when I am weak. I will be free. Your power at work in me. I'm broken gracefully. I'm strong when I am weak. I will be free. Yeah, your power at work in me. I'm broken gracefully. I'm strong when I am weak. pouring out my life, gracefully broken. Don't put new wine into old wineskins. He wants to make you new friends. In the crushing, in the pressing, you are making new wine. In the soil now surrender. You are breaking new ground. So I yield to you into your careful hand. When I trust you, I don't need to understand. Make me your vessel. Make me offering. Make me whatever you want me to be. I came here with nothing. All you have given me, Jesus, bring new wine out of me. In the crushing, in the pressing, you are making new wine. In the soil I now surrender. You are breaking new ground. You are breaking new ground. So make me your vessel. Make me an offering. Make me whatever you want me to be. I came here with nothing, but all you have given me. Jesus, bring new wine out of me. Jesus, bring new wine out of me. Bring new wine out of me. 'Cause where there is new wine, there is new power, there is new freedom. The kingdom is here. I lay down my old flames to carry a new fire today. So make me a vessel, make me an offering, make me whatever you want me to be. God, I came here with nothing, but all you have given me. Jesus, bring new wine out of me. Jesus, bring new wine out of me. Jesus, bring new wine out of me. 'Cause where there is new wine, there is new power, there is new freedom. The kingdom is here. I lay down my old flames to carry a new fire today. 'Cause where there is new wine, there is new power, there is new freedom. The kingdom is here. I lay down my old flames to carry a new fire today. came here with nothing but all you have given me. Jesus, bring new wine out of me. Jesus, bring new wine out of me. Jesus, bring new wine out of me.
Well, good morning, Water's Edge. I just wanted to begin by saying Happy Mother's Day to all the mothers out there. It's sad that we can't be with you today, but that doesn't mean we don't love you. And so my heart goes out to all the mothers today. Just to let you know, I had most of today's sermon for this week written, and right now I'm throwing a bit of a change up, and I'm changing it on the fly because honestly there's just been some things going on that it's been hard for me this week, and I'm processing, and I thought that maybe this week, instead of something really polished and well thought out, maybe it'd be okay to just kind of talk through some things and my own response to what's going on in the world right now. There's two things that have happened this week that have just kind of really affected me deeply. The first thing that really got me going this week was the release of the Ahmaud Arbery case. And if you haven't heard of this case, back in February, there was a young black man in Georgia that went out for a run, and he was killed by two white men. They weren't police, although one of them has some connection to the police. And now I don't know all the intricacies and the details of what they thought and what he did. But what I do know is that Ahmaud was unarmed. He was out for a run, and that he was killed. Now, Ahmaud was killed back in February, and I understand that there's been some pretty crazy things going on in our world over the past couple of months, but it took until this week for someone to be arrested in the case. And they knew who had done it. They knew who had killed him. And what's worse is it took the release of footage from the shooting for anything to be done at all. Nothing happened in March. Nothing happened in April. Again, I don't know all the ins and outs of the case, and I'm sure we'll learn more in the upcoming weeks, but if you can imagine the feelings of that family, of Ahmaud's family, of a family that their son had been murdered, had been killed, and nothing was being done. That they knew exactly who had killed their son, and yet nothing was being done. This type of racism and hate, it's one of the things that really upsets me, and it gets me physically angry because this type of violence, it just shouldn't happen. This racism, it goes against everything that I believe and everything that I believe that we are trying to build as the church. And I think about the teachings of Christ and how Jesus would use examples of people that were disliked and hated in the culture where he was. And he would teach with those people in mind. Jesus would push people to accept those that they wouldn't normally accept. And I have a hard time reconciling how we as a society and a culture could allow something like this to happen. And what really gets me going is this type of thing happens all too often. That there are people that just, there's this injustice in our world, in our society, in our culture. And I'm not saying that this happened in New Buffalo, but to be perfectly honest, it could. It could happen. I can't say for certain that it absolutely wouldn't. And that is sad to me. The second thing that happened to me this week is that I got word from someone in Dowagiac, and I had someone call me. They said, "Hey, do you remember Adam? Adam's really sick with COVID. Could you pray with him? Could you pray for him?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'll pray for Adam. Like, what's going on?" And so I connected with a few people that I haven't talked to in a little while, and this person is someone that I knew from when I first started playing Dungeons and Dragons, and the reason that they wanted to call for me, they wanted to call me was because they wanted me to pray, and they knew that I was a pastor and I was a praying type, and so Adam was sick and in the hospital, and by the time that I heard word, ventilators had already been given to him. He didn't respond well to the ventilator, so they put him in a medically induced coma, and I got word on Friday morning that Adam passed away. This is Adam right here, and it's not a great picture. Adam didn't really like to have his photo taken. He wasn't a selfie kind of guy, but I printed this off Facebook because I wanted you to see that here's someone that I knew that died from COVID-19. And Adam was there the very first night that I was looking to make friends, and so I walked into a comic book shop that had, you know, these tabletop role-playing games, and it was like one of the first nights that I ever played Dungeons and Dragons. Adam was there, and he was there, and he welcomed me. He was one of the first people that welcomed me, and he's one of the people that, you know, here's this stranger just coming in off the street, and I realized that we didn't become best of friends. But I knew Adam, and Adam knew me. We knew each other's names. We said hi to one another. We had conversations, and now he's gone. He'll be a statistic in the numbers for the state of Michigan in the upcoming days. And now one of the things that's striking me incredibly hard right now is that in our state, the state of Michigan, as of Friday, May 8th, we have had 4,343 deaths. And they weren't all named Adam, but one of them was. And to think that is 4,343 people that had families, and those families are mourning the loss of their loved ones. And many of those families, they weren't able to be with their loved ones as they were dying, and because the virus is so contagious. And many of these families will be forced to have a private funeral, meaning they will only be able to have at most 10 people in attendance if they can afford a funeral at all. And that means that there are thousands of people right now in our state that are mourning and are just not able to say goodbye. And that's just the state of Michigan. In the state of Indiana, which is just down the road, I mean, my house literally is probably a quarter mile from the state of Michigan, maybe a half mile, or the state of Indiana, maybe a half mile. The church is a half mile from the state of Indiana. There's another 1,295 deaths according to Friday. That's another almost 1,300 families that are going through this. And if you take a look at the entirety of the United States, that's 77,000 people that have died. And worldwide, that number is 271,000. When we start talking numbers, and a lot of people are doing this right now, they're talking numbers, and it's easy to do. What we do is, and this happens on social media all the time, we'll start talking about how these numbers, they aren't that high, and how these numbers, they aren't that bad. And when we do that, what we're doing is we're dehumanizing, you know, the statistics. Is what we're doing is we're taking these statistics and we're eradicating the names from them. We are removing the families away from the situation. And when we do that, we move into the realm of statistics, and we move away from this idea of loving one another. And so today, this week, and I knew it was going to happen, this week, I know someone personally that died from COVID-19. And it's just breaking my heart. And I think that we, as a community, as a culture, are starting to see, and in some places we've already seen this for a long time, that there is this rising feeling in many of us. And that feeling is one of hopelessness, of restlessness, of anger at injustice, of being sick of not being able to do the things that we know that we need to do. We're seeing fear start to come out. We're seeing that division is alive and well in our communities, that this pandemic it's causing us to see the things that were cracks in the fabric of our society. Those cracks are now widening. They're getting bigger and bigger. And so now we're seeing the problems that need to be confronted. And so this week I'm taking all of this in, and I've been taking it in for you know, a while now, just like all of you, and I'm seeing all of these things, all of these problems, this pain, and And I'm just feeling it right now. And I think that in some way we are all feeling it right now. And so a question comes to the forefront of our minds. And it's a big question for those that believe in God. And especially when we believe in God and we're going through really, really difficult times. And the question is this: where is God? Where is God in the midst of all of this? We've been in this series called Responding to COVID-19, and we've been looking at various stories in the Bible, and we've been looking at ways in which these people in the Bible, they went through their own difficult times and how they responded, and we're trying to see how that can speak into our lives, so hopefully that we can respond in a positive way. But today, I want to talk about how do we answer this question? Where is God? And what do we do when the answer is, I don't know? I don't know. Because there's times in all of our lives when it feels like God is not there. When it feels like God is pulled away. And now I say it feels like God is not present, and it feels like God is far away, because what is true is actually that God is really right here, that God is in the midst of all of this. Just because we can't see it or just because we can't feel it, it doesn't mean that God is not listening. It doesn't mean that God is not responding. It doesn't mean that God has lost control of the situation or that God has gone away. So today, what I want to do is I want to share several stories with you from the Bible, and we'll just take them in snippets, and so we're going to have kind of a high view of these stories, but I want to highlight times in the Bible where people probably felt much like many of us are feeling right now. And I want to ask the question, where was God? The first story I want to talk about today is the story of Joseph. And there are a couple of Josephs in the Bible. The story I want to talk about is Old Testament Joseph, and not New Testament Joseph, who was married to Mary and was Jesus' non-biological dad. Old Testament Joseph, he was the one with a big family. He had a fancy coat of many colors, if you remember. But I want to pick up Joseph's story when he was thrown into a well. You see, Joseph had been tossed down in this well by his brothers. And currently his brothers are arguing amongst one another about what to do with Joseph. You see, some of his brothers, they wanted to kill him. And some of his brothers wanted to sell him into slavery. Now, if you can imagine being Joseph in this situation, your life is literally not in your hands anymore. You are at the mercy of people who want to do you harm. There is nowhere to run. There's nowhere to turn. His life is literally in his brother's hands. And I think about this story, and I think about Ahmad going out for a run and never coming home. I think about children being kidnapped and taken into the slave trade in our world today. And I think that these types of things, we have a tendency to think that these types of things don't happen anymore, but they are still happening in our world today. And so where is God in the story of Joseph? For those of you that know the story, you know that Joseph is sold into slavery, and he ends up in Egypt, and he works hard, but he ends up in prison, and it's only because he's able to interpret dreams, it's only because he has a gift from God that he's brought before the Pharaoh, and he ends up interpreting the Pharaoh's dreams, and the Pharaoh is so appreciative that he lets Joseph have his freedom, and then all of a sudden Joseph keeps reporting back to Pharaoh, and he keeps escalating his rank until finally Joseph becomes the second most powerful person in all the land of Egypt. There's Pharaoh, and then Joseph is like the advisor to the Pharaoh. And so he's the second most powerful person in all of Egypt. And then a famine strikes, and this famine, it strikes over a huge portion of the world. And so Joseph's family that originally sold him into slavery, that were originally threatening to kill him, they end up showing up and begging the officials of Egypt for food. Well, guess who the official was? It was Joseph. And all of a sudden, Joseph is able to see that God's hand was with him all along to bring him to this point where he could save his family. Now, does God condone the violence? No. Does God create the violence? Absolutely not. That's our own human hearts. That's our own frailty. That's our own fallenness. But God uses the situation and is able to work amazing things through Joseph's life. Another story that comes to mind is one of a mother being forced to make an impossible choice. This woman's name was Jochebed, and you may not recognize her name, but I bet you'll recognize her story. 400 years after Joseph and his family came to Egypt, their descendants had been enslaved by the Egyptians. So they were slaves for 400 years. God was blessing this family, and they had many children. And the Egyptians, they were watching this family grow, and they were growing, and they were growing, and they were growing. And after 4 centuries, their descendants had become so numerous that the Egyptians were getting scared. They're saying, what happens if these Israelites, they rise up against us? And so they enslaved the people. But still, the people ended up having more and more children. And so the Pharaoh ordered that all the boys be killed under a certain age. And so any new baby that was born that was a boy was to be killed. And as you can imagine, every baby that was born was hidden from the authorities before they could see if it was a boy or a girl. But at a certain point, a baby just becomes impossible to hide. And so Jochebed was a new mother, and she'd just given birth to a son, and she knew his life was in danger, because if he were to be found by the Egyptian authorities, they would have killed him. So she did something a little heroic and a little crazy. She made a little boat out of reeds. She wrapped her baby in blankets, and she floated her son away from her down the river Nile. Now, the Nile is full of crocodiles, large fish. The baby could have rolled over and the boat would have, came over. And can you imagine, though, the impossible choice going through this mother's mind of, do you stay with your child and watch him being killed? Or can you completely let go of your control over the well-being of this child and float your son down the river to give him a chance at survival? And she knew it was just a tiny chance. But she also knew that tiny chance was better than guaranteed death. What a horrible choice that has to be made. This story, it reminds me in some ways of the people that are losing their own sons and daughters to COVID. Also the people that own small businesses and have had to shut down everything they've built because of this pandemic. Their livelihood is just gone. Their future is up in the air. They've had to make an impossible choice. The question rises for Jochebed: where is God in this? We almost all know this story from the book of Exodus. That little boy that was floated down the river would be adopted by none other than Pharaoh's daughter. Pharaoh's daughter found him and said, yeah, a baby, I want to keep it. And so she keeps it. And Moses, which is the name she gave him, was raised in the Pharaoh's house. He was given the best education. He was given the best of everything. And eventually, Moses would be the one that would lead the Israelite people out of slavery, out of Egypt. In fact, it was Moses that was God's response to the people crying out for 400 years because of the slavery that they were enduring, because of the suffering that they were enduring. God answered their prayers with that baby. One last story. And this is another young mother. This mother was named Mary, who had just given birth to the baby Jesus. And she was woken up in the middle of the night one night, and she was told, pack up your newborn son, take your family and run. King Herod had gotten word that Jesus had been born. And instead of going and looking for this newborn king, he sent out his goons and basically said, kill every child under a certain age in this area. And so Joseph and Mary, they wrapped up baby Jesus and they ran. Where did they run? Ironically, they went to Egypt. And so, but they knew that certain death for this child lay behind them. So they left their home. They left all that they had. And if you can think about this story, think about all the families that didn't make it out. Think about all the families that night lost one of their children. And they lost their child. That child was killed because these people lived at the whim of a psychotic tyrant. I think about how today I hear about the lives that are being lost to injustice around the world, how unfair our system can be to those that look different than we do, to people that are being chased away from their homes by violence and gangs only to have no place to go. Can you imagine being a refugee like Mary and Joseph and Jesus? And they're on the road. They've left everything that they've known and they're just hoping to survive. And they just ask the question, where is God now? The reality is that God was with Mary and Joseph and Jesus, and that they would get home after the death of Herod. They would be able to come home, and we all know how intimate was the relationship between God and Jesus, how Jesus was and is the only person to be called God's own son. These stories, and if you want to read the Bible, so many of the stories from the Bible, they're here to teach us something. And if you read the stories from the scriptures, you get stories like almost none of them are simple, happy stories that where the character, they did what they were supposed to do and then they lived happily ever after. There's almost none of those stories in the Bible. Instead, what the Bible is full of are people that are living through incredibly difficult times, people that are at the end of themselves, people that cannot save themselves, and stories about how their faith endured, about how God intervened. But in just about every one of these stories, you can find moments that feel familiar to the place where we find ourselves today. You can find moments when those people all those years ago had to be wondering, where is God? If you take just the example of the Israelites in Egypt and before Moses was raised up to bring them out, we told the story of Moses' mom, Jochebed, but the people, they had been slaves for 400 years. That's 400 years of crying out to God without an answer to that prayer. Before the birth of Jesus, people hadn't heard from God in over 500 years. The Romans had come, the exile had happened, people were hurting and suffering. Where was God? And the answer to that question is that God was there all along. That God was preparing to do something incredible. In each and every one of these stories, we see God work in amazing ways. For Joseph, God had created a place where he would be able to save his entire family, where the wounds of his childhood could be healed and the prosperity for his family and for generations could be found. For Jochebed, it would be her son that she pushed down the river that would grow up to become the one called by God to lead her and all of her people out of Egypt and into a free life. For Mary and Joseph, God was with them so that not only could they be saved from Herod, but so that all people who would come to call on the name of their son Jesus would be able to be saved from death. Church, if you or someone you know is going through a difficult time right now, I can't just tell you that everything's going to be peachy. I can't just tell you that God is going to swoop down and make everything okay in a moment. And if I did, I would be ignoring large swaths of biblical history. The question comes down to this: is it possible that God is still active? That God is still accomplishing his purposes when there is no indication of that activity? Is it possible that God is still active in your world and in the world at large when everything seems to be going backwards? When everything seems so very dark? depending on how you answer that question, will determine your response to our current situation and our current uncertainty. If we were to go back and interview Joseph and Jochebed and Mary and ask them this question, when in your life did it seem like it was the darkest? I think that they would all probably point to the places in their story that we pointed out today. Mary might point to Jesus' death on the cross, but other than that, I think that they would point out and say, this is the darkest, most difficult time that I had to go through. But these times that they went through, they were hard and difficult, much like the times that we are going through today. Now, if we were to continue that interview and we were to ask these people, when was God doing God's greatest work in your life? I think that they would also point to these exact darkest moments, that they would say that here is where God was working the most in my heart, that God was preparing to do something amazing, something that would change the world for the better, that would change my world for the better. There was no way for them to know it at the time. There was no way that they would say, oh, I knew it at the time. I knew that I was just, no, they would say, this was when my world was the darkest. And looking back now over my life, now I can see that this is where God was preparing me for something amazing. There was no way for them to know it. They simply had to have faith as they were going through it. Because the reality is this. When life feels uncertain, God is not. When life feels uncertain, God is not. When our world is being turned upside down and going crazy, God is still God. And God is here with us. And we just don't know what God is up to in the moment. But that's not our role. That's not who we're called to be. We're not called to know everything that God is going to do. The song that we sang right before the sermon was called Gracefully Broken, and it points us directly to times like this. And I'm not saying that God is breaking you. God doesn't have to. The world takes care of that. The situations we put ourselves into take care of that. But God can use that brokenness. God can turn that brokenness into something new, something more. God can heal us from our brokenness, and all the meanwhile be bringing us closer than we ever thought possible to himself. So, what is our response when we start asking the question, where is God? It's simple. It's to go back to these stories in the scriptures, these stories of people in difficult circumstances, and it's to remind ourselves that when life feels uncertain, God is not. But I hear someone say, Pastor, this isn't going to find me a job right now. This isn't going to pay the bills. This isn't going to bring that person back. This isn't going to solve all my problems. I know. The truth is, you're right. This isn't going to solve all your problems. And God never promised to solve all of your problems. But as Paul said, God's power is made perfect in our weaknesses, not in our strengths, in our weaknesses. When we are weak, then God is strong. It is going through difficult times when we will grow, when we will change, when we will actually sit down and pray because life is hard, and that's what brings us to God. And while believing this won't solve all of your problems, it will, maybe, just maybe, allow you to maintain hope and faith in the meantime. It may just allow you to go to bed at night with the confidence that God has not abandoned you. And hopefully it will motivate you to be on the lookout for how God's grace and intervention is out in the world today. Because let me tell you, God is working right now. We only have to have eyes to see it. Hopefully this news will keep you from leaning in directions that will only make things worse. And hopefully it will protect you from despair. So church, this is what I'm reflecting on today. And I want to invite you to join me, because right now what we need is not so much to get out and do something amazing and it's going to change everything and then all of a sudden everything is going to just swoop in and be okay. That's not how the story works. That's not how I've seen God work in the scriptures and in my own life. Instead, we need to answer the question, where are you, God? And maybe look in ourselves and see if we are truly okay with our situation, whether we can see God in the situation or not. And so we trust that God is there. We have faith that God is working. And in the meantime, we pray, we hope, we do what little we can. That is our response. Will you pray with me? God, right now I want to pray for all those that are going through a difficult time with this pandemic. And God, I pray that your presence would be with us all, whether we can see it, whether we can feel it, whether we can hear you or not. God, I pray that your grace, your peace, your love would be with all those that need you in this time. God, we need you. Reveal yourself to all those that are hurting today. In Jesus' name, amen.
Well, friends, I'm hoping that we can close up and that I can put a smile on your face singing something a little bit fun about our God who is so marvelous that all we can do is just stand amazed in his presence. I stand amazed in your presence, oh Jesus, the Nazarene, and wonder how he could love me, a sinner condemned, unclean. How marvelous, how wonderful, and my song shall ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me. He took my sin and my sorrows, he made them his very own. He bore the burden to Calvary, and he suffered and died alone. How marvelous, how wonderful, and my song shall ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me. When with ransomed in glory, his face I at last shall see. 'Twill be my joy through the ages to sing of his love for me. How marvelous, how wonderful, and my song shall ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love Live in that love this week, friends. Have a great week.